The guest country at this year's Frankfurt Book Fair is Brazil. Arts.21 takes a trip into a country full of contrasts and visits its most fascinating writers.
We start in Sao Paulo. The city can overwhelm strangers with its extremes, and it's growing every day as more people arrive seeking fortune and fulfillment. Nowhere else in the Southern Hemisphere are so many people gathered in one place. 20 million. Writer Luiz Ruffato tackles this sprawling metropolis on a daily basis. What results is great literature.
My role as a writer is simple. I let myself be influenced by people in a physical way. I'm not a cerebral writer. I enjoy writing so that I can smell things, feel cold and heat, be touched by people, and use all 5 senses.
In 2001, he published his debut novel, There Were Many Horses. His characters are ordinary people, workers who get up early and whose daily life is decided by others, people no one takes an interest in. It's made up of 69 fragments, all set on one day in Sao Paulo. Luiz Ruffato is from a working-class background and worked his way through university as a mechanic. Without him, Brazil's lower middle class would have no voice in literature.
Formal education is a privilege in Brazil, not a right. The rich are the ones who get a good education. So the rich write about the rich. They write about bandits too because they're glamorous. But they write because they have access to education. The lower middle class doesn't. So they don't write about themselves.
Today, Ruffato can live from his writing. He finds his stories while out walking. He listens, becomes immersed.
Amados irmãos da República do Brasil, comento que hoje no Brasil.
You could say he collects fates.
This woman shuffling like a scarecrow through the streets of Morumbi wasn't always like this, no. One day she became so. It was late. Her 11-year-old daughter didn't return from school, her face weary in the kitchen. Mother, night, morning, the blanket, the sheet still smooth, nothing the next day or the next.
His texts speak of pain, but they're only fragments of Sao Paulo. Ruffato arrived here by bus more than 20 years ago. He wasn't a mechanic anymore. He was a journalist looking for a start. For the first few months, he slept at the bus station. 13 years ago, he wrote his kaleidoscopic debut novel, which is still valid today.
Maybe the lives of these people haven't progressed at all. If anything, a few of them will have a little more comfort, a little more money. But as regards happiness, which is what interests me, I don't think they are any happier than they were 13 years ago, unfortunately.
In our South by plane, life is different. Rio de Janeiro has something more welcoming and open. Carola Saavedra was born in Chile. As an adult, she spent 10 years abroad in Germany, France, and Spain. But her home is Brazil, in Rio.
When I came back to Rio, I took this trip on the ferry once a week. It was about this moment of returning to Rio, approaching the city physically. It was a way of really returning home.
Oh, to live in Rio. It's the embodiment of Brazilian flair, the cult of the body, beach culture, and an easy togetherness under an eternal sun. With or without a football. But here on Ipanema Beach, no one has a book. In her most recent novel, just released in German, Carola Saavedra decided to leave Rio. Landscape with Dromedaries is set on an unnamed island. The narrator, an artist named Erika, recalls a love triangle, reflects on death and art and universal issues. Brazil seems a long ways away.
Even if I write a book set on an island that has nothing to do with Brazil and deals with subjects that aren't specifically Brazilian, I can only write it based on my experience and my language. So it's a Brazilian book.
Looking back, Saavedra describes her 10 years in Europe, especially in Germany, as years of training. Access to literature and art was easier for her than ever before, and she knows she might never have become an author if she hadn't lived abroad for so long.
Being a foreigner has parallels with being a writer. As an author, when you create a character, you have to put yourself in that person's role, and you have to know how that person, who is so different from you, thinks.
This view of the world has made Carola Saavedra successful. Our journey continues down to Porto Alegre, in the extreme south of the country where the climate is noticeably harsher. Here, as across most of Brazil, people are out on the streets to protest against corruption, social inequality, and police brutality. Porto Alegre means Merry Harbor. It's not far from the sea. All kinds of fish are available. And this is the city where Daniel Galera's drama, Blood-Drenched Beard, came into existence. It's the dark family tale of a young man in a small coastal town searching for traces of his grandfather, who was apparently murdered.
The fishermen don't talk much to him. Everyone he's tried to talk to about his grandfather's death now ignores him. Some watch him with hostile looks as he walks through the village center, while others greet him with what feels like exaggerated friendliness. He sometimes worries that he's being paranoid. He isn't really sure who's who. And he stopped asking questions because he started to feel scared.
The novel is based on the story of a murder which a fisherman told to Galera's father in the 1970s. He passed the tale on to his son years later. It's the story of being an outsider, of not belonging. The main character has face blindness. He can't immediately recognize the people around him. It's a rare condition, and he doesn't want to talk about it. It also makes it harder for him to settle here. And he closely resembles his grandfather, who it said was murdered during the village fiesta. But why? And why was there no body? The grandson spends the winter there next to the sea, running and swimming. His search is intertwined with political events, corruption, economic change, globalization. The atmosphere of the book is unbelievably dense, and it's a declaration of love for the sea.
The sea has two functions. One is more symbolic. It's a constant companion of my hero. It affects his mood every single day. And then there's another aspect. How does the sea affect the everyday life of a small town of 15,000 people? And people lived in that town from fishing for hundreds of years. But now the town's turning more and more into a tourist destination.
Galera wrote the book in Porto Alegre and not at the coast. The city has been one of Brazil's cultural centers for years. People take an active interest in political and social issues, such as the countrywide wave of protests in June. Galera remembers the burning trash containers and the air of tension.
These events will soon make their way into the works of authors, but it's still really present in people's minds. I need a bit of distance to see what all these demonstrations will result in. But I think it was something that Brazil can learn from.
Brazil has around 196 million inhabitants. So there are countless surprising, moving, and quirky stories to tell. And this Frankfurt Book Fair gives us the chance to hear more of them than ever before.